Coming up in this episode of In Clear Focus.
If you activate in Pride Month, you're really saying, I'm a brand that's here for LGBT rights and I really stand up for those consumers, which is great if you do. But I think that comes with a bit of scrutiny about well, what are you actually doing?
You're listening to In Clear Focus, produced weekly by Big Eye, a strategy-led, full-service creative agency growing brands for clients globally. Hello, I'm your host, Adrian Tennant, Chief Strategy Officer. Thank you for joining us. In June of 1969, patrons of the Stonewall Inn in New York City staged an uprising to resist frequent harassment of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks at the hands of the police. This was a time when it was all too common for LGBTQ Americans to be subjected to persecution. That uprising marked the beginning of a national and then international movement to outlaw discriminatory laws and practices. Today, members of the LGBTQIA+ community, allies and supporters celebrate queer history, culture and creativity during June, designated Pride Month. But how should brands navigate support for members of the LGBTQIA+ community and other marginalized groups of consumers? As we've discussed previously on this podcast, a majority of the youngest generation of consumers, Gen Z, expect brands to be inclusive. To discuss the opportunities and challenges that inclusive marketing presents, our guest this week is uniquely well qualified. Currently writing a book on the topic, which promises to provide clear, actionable guidance for folks working agency side and client side, Jerry Daykin is a global marketing leader who has held senior roles at brands including GSK Consumer Healthcare, Diageo, and Mondelez. Jerry is also a diversity ambassador and co-chair of the World Federation of Advertisers Diversity Task Force, where he created the WFA's framework for representation and inclusion, and sits on the diversity and inclusion boards at the Advertising Association, the Conscious Advertising Network, and Outvertising. Jerry also writes for publications including The Drum, Adweek, Campaign, Marketing Week, and The Guardian, and is a regular conference speaker. Currently the Vice President, Head of Global Media at Beam Suntory, Jerry is joining us today from his home in London, England. Jerry, welcome to In Clear Focus.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
What's your definition of inclusive marketing?
Oh, it's a big one. I think sometimes it's just vector marketing. Like it's our job as marketers to understand all the different consumers that we try and talk to. And so true inclusive marketing is just when we get outside our own bubbles, when we get outside of our own kind of narrow view of the world and we truly talk to all the consumers out there. But yeah, it definitely can manifest itself in terms of kind of better representation, inclusion, etc. on the screen. But it starts definitely with the kind of the thinking and the strategy and the people behind the screen as well. The whole process needs to change to just better do our jobs.
Well, you've had many articles and opinion pieces published in marketing and ad industry publications, and today you're recognized as an expert in inclusive marketing. So when did you realize that this was an area you really wanted to focus on?
I mean, I'm a gay man myself. And I think as a kid, when I was trying to work out who I was or what I was quite aware that certainly in the 80s in the UK, I mean, literally it was illegal in schools and things. You didn't see yourself anyway. You didn't see what that was. And when I first started to glimpse TV shows like Queer as Folk or occasionally adverts, maybe more in queer spaces, but, trying to talk to that, I realized from a fairly young age the power of media advertising to either positively normalize or more often than not exclude. So I think it's in the back of my mind been something I've been thinking about for quite a long time. But I've naturally fallen into it over the last couple of years. I think, and it's obviously become a bigger topic in the industry, and I've been someone who's been willing to talk about it. And I got involved in an organization called Outvertising about 5-6 years ago now, and they are specifically focused on LGBT inclusion in the industry, both trying to make people who work in the industry feel more comfortable and welcome and really challenging brands to push things externally. And so it started from that. And I think because I was one of a fairly small list of like brand side marketers willing to sort of chat about this, I ended up getting involved in the British Advertising Association's D&I forum and eventually graduated somehow to the World Federation of Advertisers, where over the last couple of years, I've been one of their diversity ambassadors. So I sort of slightly fell into it by it being a personal passion of mine. and just going along with the ride and the opportunity and just seeing how critical it is that we do drive this change. So we need some people to chat about it.
Well, you've been writing a book entitled Inclusive Marketing: Why Representation Matters to Your Customers and Your Brand, which is due to be published in October by our friends at Kogan Page. Jerry, what prompted you to write the book?
Yeah, I'm feeling like this exclusive teaser of that because it's the first time I've spoken to anyone about that. But two things that prompted me. One, chatting to the Kogan Page people, and they just thought there was a real opportunity because kind of no one has written a book on that. I mean, it's a fairly new topic. There are certainly guides and plenty of panels and thought pieces out there, but it's not really a kind of a book that goes into more detail. And secondly, it was building a lot of the work that we did at the World Federation of Advertisers over the last couple of years with a whole bunch of other advertisers. We've been digging into this kind of question of like, if so many advertisers nowadays accept that they want to do more inclusive marketing, why is it still quite slow to happen? And we kind of talked through the whole creative process and decided that there were like at every stage of that process, there are kind of moments where your bias, where your lack of experience, where your own narrow vision sometimes stops you seeing the opportunity for inclusion or perhaps actively excludes people. And so we created a bit of a small guide last year, and it just felt like a perfect storm to dig a bit deeper into that guide for people who really wanted to go a bit further. The representation matters bit in the subtitles is quite key to me because one of the main things I've done in the book is actually interviewed over 20 different marketers from different big companies and agencies and brands and things. I really start every conversation kind of like we have almost today by saying like, why does this matter to you personally? And I think some of those personal stories and those personal insights are some of the most persuasive things because we can bang on about the stats of inclusion and the business opportunity as much as you like. But when you hear some of those opportunities, so yeah, I wanted to have a chance to bring that framework to a bit more depth, to a bit more life, and really to talk to some of those marketers and share some of their stories.
What has the writing and editing process been like for you? Has it required a different mindset than, say, writing articles?
Yeah, I definitely didn't know what I was getting into when I did it. And actually, it kind of worked out really well because I was on gardening leave for a couple of months between jobs. So it sort of worked out perfectly. And I thought, I'll do a bit of this whilst I'm enjoying my gardening leave. And it took up a lot more of that gardening leave than I expected it would, perhaps naively. And certainly, I think to begin with, I thought it was a clever shortcut to interview lots of other people and use their words to fill up. But actually, I really enjoyed those conversations, but they took a huge amount of time to, have the conversation, edit them down, write them up and things. And yeah, I was quite conscious throughout that I think it's one thing writing an article and giving people a sort of a headline of, this is what you should do. When you get into a book and you're trying to write a whole chapter or even just a few pages going into each of those phases, you've got to be kind of really clear on another depth of guidance, of advice. I suppose I'm conscious that people hopefully are going to pay for the book. So I feel like quite a high duty for it to be actually quite interesting and good. And I have peak imposter syndrome some days. So yeah, it was quite different. I'd be lying if there wasn't a few late nights in the last week or so when it was due and I was up gone midnight just editing and adding a few bits in here and there. I tried to be well planned and disciplined.
As I mentioned in the intro, June is Pride Month. As brands seek to align themselves with the LGBTQIA plus community and show support, this requires more than slapping a rainbow on the packaging. What are some of the most common misconceptions you found marketers and brand managers have about LGBTQIA plus consumers?
Yeah, there's a part of me that thinks it's fantastic that lots of brands do slap a rainbow on a packaging. Because as I said, when I was a kid, I'd have loved it to see rainbows everywhere. I love it when my mum goes into Marks and Spencer's and she sees Pride everywhere. And it's sort of one wonderfully middle-class normalization of it. But yes, there is a fine line. A lot of members of the community feel that some of those brands are doing it much more to cash in and make a profit, etc., than they are to sort of truly support. I think one of the biggest issues we have is that the LGBT community, even within itself, is highly stereotyped. And if you look at the portrayals of that community, certainly to begin with, I think it's getting better, but they've been quite male, they've been quite gay, and they're often quite young. It's often about partying and clubbing and drinking, which of course is a fabulous part of the gay identity, but a very small slice of it. There are plenty of gay men who don't enjoy that. There are plenty of lesbian, bisexual, trans, everything else in the spectrum who don't necessarily feel massively represented by that. They probably still think it's nice that brands are moving a little bit in their direction. So I think there's a sort of a caution that although we talk about this community, it's a community of hundreds of millions of people. So like any other audience, there's a lot of nuance, a lot of different aspects of it. So I think brands have to be a little bit careful of that. And I think whilst Pride Month is always a great chance to nudge ourselves in the right direction and think about this, I'm always cautious it may not be the best place to start. Because I think if you activate in Pride Month, you're really saying like, I'm a brand that's here for LGBT rights and I really stand up for those consumers, which is great if you do. But I think that comes with a bit of scrutiny about like, well, what are you actually doing? What are your actual policies? What are you actually doing internally? How do you treat your LGBT customers? I often think it's almost, if you want to start on this journey, it's maybe a bit safe to start around the year and try and do something outside of that peak season. Start talking to LGBT consumers, start advertising in LGBT publications, start making sure that your own internal LGBT employees are well looked after and resourced. And then perhaps Pride can be the icing on that cake. But as I say, I don't mind companies like changing their logos to rainbow for Pride, but I wouldn't make that the first step I take. I would start elsewhere, really start representing and talking to that community. And then if you want to do that, brilliant. Sure, why not? I think if you don't, you can easily get called out by people who are like, why have you changed your logo when you don't have a policy towards trans people in your own company, or you've had this bad issue, or, various different things.
Which consumer brands do you think do a really good job of engaging with the LGBTQIA plus community authentically?
Yeah, I like brands that kind of have been in it for the long term. In the UK, and I think to an extent globally, the Skittles brand is one that I've seen do that, part of the Mars company's portfolio. I know they've had sort of a multi-year partnership with Gay Times. So they've been working with and talking to a publication that represents that community. I think it's helped them have an authentic voice. This past year or so, they did a great activation, which was sponsoring the digging out of old black and white photos from historic prides, recoloring them and sharing them in that editorial. And I think they've been doing that for 4 or 5 years, having special packaging where they remove the rainbow from their packaging because their message is that there are other rainbows that matter. So I love that they're stuck with it for a few years. It's not just a brand manager somewhere decided, oh, this year let's do Pride. They've really built a platform, worked with the community on it. They're a big organization, but I think Procter & Gamble, P&G do a really good job. They actually have a dedicated person, I think, whose job is LGBT inclusion and how their business can work with those communities and things. And you see that come to life in a whole load of different ways. I know in the US, they've done a partnership with GLAAD. And I think they've even created resources that other advertisers can get for free and can tap into to help them do that. It's a really deliberate approach. This is a community that matters. These are some of our own colleagues that matter. This is an audience that we want to do the right thing with and by. And so you find other examples of brands that have done kind of one-off campaigns and really nice things. But those two stand out as brands I've said, we're really going to do this and we're going to still be doing it in 4 or 5 years' time. And we're going to invest in the people and the resources and the partnerships to get there rather than just, we've got a bit of money left over this year. So let's throw it at a Pride float, which isn't a bad thing to do, but it's not a thorough thing to do.
One of the things I learned about you during the COVID lockdowns is that you're a hardcore Lego fan. You posted images to LinkedIn of, I think it was an amusement park that you'd built.
Yes.
Which generated a lot of engagement. So I'm curious, what do you think about the initiative Lego announced at the beginning of this month to encourage more open conversations among families about sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression?
Yeah, I was always a fan of Lego since a kid, and with a lot of spare time on my hands and a few cancelled holidays and things, I was like, right, I'm going big. So I built a huge roller coaster thing, which is a great set. They launched, I guess it was last Pride, like an LGBT set, progressive rainbow with all the different colors, all the different characters and things. And it was designed by one of their senior designers, who I think is LGBT himself. So it was a passion project from someone in the business. And it was sort of interesting at the time because whilst I think it was very largely warmly received, there's always going to be those people out there being like, oh, Lego's a kids brand. And how dare you show this rainbowy stuff to kids? And that's why I think it's a great thing, because I think that you have to approach conversations around sexuality and gender and things carefully with kids because they are young. You wouldn't talk to them about straight sex. You probably wouldn't want to, discussing certain things with them. But I think it's also important to normalize that conversation and be like, well, it's kind of, if you don't talk about it at all, I mean, you just like surprise them with it when they're 18 or something, that of course that's going to be weird and messy. LGBT inclusion, whilst for the most part, everyone loves it and it's great and it's brilliant, it comes with a risk. And especially I think if you're a kids brand, there's the potential of backlash. There's the potential of, conservative groups to challenge you and try and cancel you and things. And I think it shows that they are genuinely committed to their colleagues, to their consumers, that they're willing to say, no, we think this is an important thing to do. If it was a chocolate bar trying to do that, you might be a bit like, why are you doing that? But no, they play a key role in the development of kids. Like it's part of how you learn to build and construct, and they're set to represent all sorts of different aspects of society and stuff. So yeah, why wouldn't they also go on that journey. Yeah, for me, that's a great example of a brand, again, trying to do something for the long term and positively and not just change its logo, but actually change its products, change its messaging, really, really try and push things forward.
Let's take a short break. We'll be right back after these messages. Each month, in partnership with our friends at Kogan Page, the Big Eye Book Club features interviews with authors who are experts in specific areas of marketing and consumer research. Our featured book for June is The Direct-to-Consumer Playbook, the stories and strategies of the brands that wrote the DTC rules, by Mike Stevens. In Clear Focus listeners can save 20% on a print or electronic version of the book with exclusive promo code BIGEYE20. This code is valid for all products and pre-orders and applies to Kogan Page's free ebook offer. To order your copy of the Direct-to-Consumer Playbook, go to koganpage.com. That's KOGANPAGE.com.
I'm Sandra Marshall, VP of Client Services at Big Eye. Every week, In Clear Focus addresses topics that impact our work as advertising professionals. At Big Eye, we always put audiences first. For every engagement, we're committed not just to understanding our clients' business challenges, but also learning about their prospects and customers' attitudes, behaviors, and motivations. These insights inform our strategy and collectively inspire the account, creative, media, and analytics teams working on our clients' projects. If you'd like to put Big Eye's audience-focused consumer insights to work for your brand, please contact us. Email info@bigeyeagency.com. Big Eye, reaching the right people in the right place at the right time.
Welcome back. I'm talking with Jerry Daykin, an expert in inclusive marketing and the author of a new book due to be published later this year entitled Inclusive Marketing: Why Representation Matters to Your Customers and Your Brand. Florida is now one of 5 states in the nation where educators and staff at public schools are explicitly prohibited from discussing LGBTQ topics as part of the curriculum. Other active Don't Say Gay bills exist in Texas, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. Yet other states have been moving in the opposite direction, establishing legal foundations for LGBTQ inclusive curriculums. This is true of Connecticut, Nevada, New Jersey, Illinois, Oregon, and Colorado. Headquartered in the UK, Lush Cosmetics has released a limited edition soap in the hopes of raising $50,000 for Equality Florida, an LGBTQ rights organization here in the state. The sparkly gold soap boasts that #GayIsOK and is just the latest step Lush Cosmetics has taken to support the queer community. So, Jerry, while Lush has decided to provide very visible support, should other brands in other categories respond to these kinds of issues? When is it appropriate to take a stand?
Without getting too drawn into the politics of it, as I said earlier, I grew up in the 80s and we had a somewhat similar law in the UK where schools are prohibited from talking about things. And from my own personal experience, which, by the way, is backed up by statistics, I still ended up gay. As you know, there's no implication that talking about these things actually change what other people do. But my own experience, as of others, was that I found it really hard. I was quite depressed at uni because there was no positive role model. There was nothing about it. So I think ultimately, in my humble opinion, that's what these laws create. They create a world in which you still have people who are gay or non-binary or trans or whatever they are. They just don't see the kind of the positive support around them and don't understand what that means for them. And that does nothing but bad. But as for brands, in the book, I talk about this sort of spectrum of where brands can support. It starts from the bad end, which is like, advertising like excludes minorities, where it's all just happy white middle class men having a lovely time, And then there's a sort of a step beyond that, which is you start to try and show different minorities, but you're probably stereotyping them. It may be a better step, or it may be a worse step. There's a stat from the Gina Davis Institute, which looks at Cannes Lion winners, recognizing the best advertising in the world. They looked at Black representation. They said, actually, Black people are reasonably well represented in Cannes Lion winners, but they are generally portrayed as less successful, less intelligent. Well, is it good that they're in the adverts if you're, putting them down? And so every brand can go beyond that to the point which is positive inclusion. So you're just genuinely doing our jobs, reflecting the consumers that are around us, which of course includes a wonderful spectrum of people on the LGBT spectrum. Not every advert needs to feature gay people, but if you're producing lots of different adverts, lots of different e-commerce creative and all sorts of things, some of them really should. And you should try and totally reflect that broad intersectionality. You should try and start talking about some of the stories. And actually, when you dig into different communities, you find really interesting, really emotive stories that are probably better than some of the boring advertising we've been doing. And there's a step beyond that, which is really about activism, taking a stand. I think sometimes brands think that, turning up at Pride is a small step, but actually that's quite a big step to make, because Pride, it's a riot, it's a challenge. It may not feel that all these times, but it's really about standing up for rights. And yes, certainly as you get into that more purposeful marketing, should my brand take a political stand on various things? I think the answer is it depends a bit on the brand, on the category. Like Lush Cosmetics is a really great example. Their whole brand is they don't really do advertising. They're built around good values, where their product is made, what they stand for. So it's really clearly a part of their journey. Like Ben & Jerry's is another famous company. When Australia had a vote on gay marriage, they literally campaigned for gay marriage. They were running adverts and things. And that's in their DNA. It's part of who they are. If that's not a part of your company, I think you need to think about what right your brand has to play in various spaces. And I think it works well when brands find a kind of a purposeful cause that fits and they can get behind. But if you've never done anything in that space at all, and you're suddenly campaigning really publicly for rights over there, it can be a bit disconcerting. And I think not every brand needs to campaign. And you've got to be careful because, whilst I may not agree with them, of course, there are many millions of people who hold very different political views to me. And you have to unpick what is just politics and what is absolute rights of your consumers and things. So it's a tricky space. I think every brand can positively represent the LGBT community. I think it's great when brands want to go further than that. But, it needs to depend on the fit around the brand, the cause you can get behind. Yeah, things like that. You've got to think carefully about that and why it makes sense. Because, it still needs to be marketing to your brand. It still needs to come back to what is the promise of your brand in the first place.
What are some of the techniques that you found are most effective in educating colleagues or clients about the value of inclusive marketing?
There's loads of great research over the last decade that shows it's more effective. Inclusive teams work harder, inclusive marketing delivers better. Various different organizations who measure advertising have proven that more progressive advertising is more memorable, is more effective. So, there's that sort of brutal fact that it's a good idea. I've always found that when I've run sessions, webinars, things like that, it's actually the personal take on it that really persuades people. Like me sharing how seeing Queer as Folk and some of those adverts when I was young was the first glimpse I got that there were other people like me. And quite a lot of people, not just LGBT people, but women have examples of when they first saw empowered women in adverts and that they weren't doing the laundry anymore or things like that. And I think that kind of opens your mind a little bit, not just to the fact that there's a business opportunity, but actually a real consumer cultural opportunity. For the most part, I've worked with people who nod along and broadly agree with all this and they want to achieve this, but they're also juggling a million other things. They're busy. They're not experts in inclusive marketing. They are from a narrow world view and they've lived in their little bubble their whole lives and they don't really know where to start. So that's where in terms of the education, we've really focused on breaking down the marketing process into different stages, thinking of some of the different questions you could ask yourself. And the two things I'd say there is that one, like anyone, whatever your background is, you can do inclusive marketing. Like you can be a super straight, white, middle class man, English speaking, everything. You can still do great inclusive marketing. But to do that, you're going to need two things. One, you're going to need a lot of empathy. Like you're going to need to think outside your box because you're going to talk to people who have very different life experiences, very different ways of reacting to content and products and things. So you really need to force yourself to be empathetic. And it's a lot easier to do that if you are surrounded in some way by people who do have some of that lived experience, who do come from different backgrounds, either in your own team, in your agency, with consultants and focus groups and things. But yeah, anyone can do inclusive marketing. If you want to do it and you're nodding along to, oh yeah, this is a good idea, you have got to be deliberate about it. Because if we're not deliberate, we're busy, we're rushed, we fall into our own assumptions about things. We only give ourselves a few weeks to cast things. We find the same people, the same actors. So yeah, you've got to twist people's arms emotionally and then arm them with the practical tools to do it.
When we first chatted a couple of weeks ago about the topics we might discuss in today's podcast, you mentioned that you work with the United Nations. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it's not. When I signed up to be a marketer, I wasn't expected to be dragged in front of the United Nations Human Rights Council, but I've actually been, and I say been in inverted commas because I've been once, but I've virtually been 2 other times. So 3 times I've been to the United Nations. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way of the other 2. The Human Rights Council is asking a lot of questions about the treatment of minorities, of migrants, of the LGBTQ community. And unfortunately, a lot of those communities remain very, very badly treated. Even in the media, still quite negatively presented, especially in the UK. We sometimes have quite a toxic media towards immigration. And they're kind of asking a fairly naive question like, why do advertisers support this stuff? And the simple answer is, in many ways, advertisers do fund hate speech. A lot of advertisers here trying to do pride stuff may accidentally be funding anti-LGBT hate speech at the same time. And there are different extremes of that. There are sites out there, clickbait sites that exist that just post horrible stories, often made up, like really nasty stuff. But they are funded by advertising. So advertisers need to have brand safety approaches. They need to have ways that stop their adverts funding that really bad stuff. And many of them do, but not enough. There are middle grounds. There are very, very substantial newspapers and TV shows that have, frankly, quite anti-trans agendas or other way phobic towards communities. And I think advertisers need to ask themselves whether they really want to support those. And there's a more positive other side as well, which is, as well as avoiding the bad stuff, make sure your advertising is funding the positive voices. So where mainstream media is covering minority communities, LGBT people, make sure you're sponsoring those shows, funding that content. And partner with the Pride Media, the Gay Times, the Divas, the Pink News, all the organizations out there and sponsor their content. I'm part of this other organization called the Conscious Advertising Network, which is who I've gone with. And they also try to provide guidance and frameworks and things for marketers. And also, because the United Nations is quite an important organization that people listen to, we're also encouraging them to lean on big companies, them to lean on the organizations that they work with, and just to spread this point of view that we need to make sure advertising is not funding hate, not encouraging the spread of negative content. And a lot of that hate is literally spread because of advertising. People find controversial stories that are negative and make up shocking claims are shared on social media. They get more clicks, they get more eyeballs, they make more money than actually telling the truth. So, it's not even necessarily people who want to be hateful, it's people who want to make money. So we just need to remove that incentive and try and calm down some of the negative media that is unfortunately out there still.
Following the death of George Floyd and others, and the global demonstrations in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, the US retailer Target publicly committed to spending more than $2 billion with Black-owned businesses by 2025. Jerry, do you have any data on retailers or brands pledging to support and buy from businesses owned by LGBTQIA+ entrepreneurs?
I don't necessarily know that I have clear evidence or numbers and things. I know, for instance, one of my competitors, and I work in a Beam Suntory alcohol company, one of the competitors that I used to work for, Diageo, has been quite vocal that they're going to commit tens of millions of dollars of their media budget to minority-owned publications. And I do know from the WFA Diversity Council I sit on that most big advertising, big marketing companies do now have supplier diversity initiatives. GSK, where I used to work, does, where I now work, they also do, where they look at their spending and they look at it right through their supply chain. So if you have like tier 1, the partners you actually pay, and tier 2, the people that supply them, etc. And some real concerted efforts to try and move money to a range of minority supporting businesses. I don't know that there are many businesses that like specifically split out, for instance, LGBT or pride organizations within that. They would kind of be looped into that kind of supplier diversity initiative, which would include any sort of minority-owned, operated, targeted businesses. But I think it is a big part of what brands, advertisers, or whatever company, if you don't work in advertising at all, companies have a huge footprint outside of their own company in terms of what they buy, where they source from. And of course, there are practicalities. Like if you're a huge company trying to source huge amounts of materials and things, the big companies that supply that stuff are probably owned by shareholders, publicly traded companies. Diversity is well lost within them, but there definitely are real opportunities. Most advertising companies have a whole load of different agencies, different partners. There are real opportunities to work with organizations owned by different people, which actually fund, LGBT communities and other minorities. And it isn't just to tick a box and it's nice. But coming right back to what we talked about at the start, if you want to do good marketing, if you want to be a good business, you need to better understand the breadth of the consumers you work with. And so if you tap into some of these organizations, they bring experience that you almost certainly don't have in your business. They bring different perspectives, different understanding, better ways of doing things. Like they may be small, but you can really be challenged and changed by that. I definitely think George Floyd was an interesting moment, certainly in the marketing industry, where it caused a lot of companies to really reflect on what are they doing to support their Black consumers, their Black colleagues, and ultimately to a broader extent, total diversity. I think it's interesting now that when the years passed and that to an extent starts to fade. I think that's why it's important to have conversations like this, to write books if you really want to, and to keep people talking about these. And I think it's great when brands then do make a public commitment like that, because they are then held accountable for it. They actually have to deliver on it. And it can't just be like post a rainbow flag, post a black square on Instagram, and then a year later slightly forget about it. So I think more brands probably could make public commitments around that and think about the fact that their advertising money, their production money, all the millions and billions of pounds that big companies spend, even if a small percentage of it, like it's often, just a few percentage, it's still millions of pounds that could, fund businesses, keep different perspectives in the media alive, really make a huge difference. So definitely do that.
What are you hoping readers will take away from your upcoming book?
Well, I hope it achieves the two things that I said that I think you need to achieve, which is one, an emotional sense of why this really blooming matters, because I loved doing the interviews with the 20 marketers I spoke to. I loved hearing their stories, some of them really unexpected personal experiences. There's a fairly famous marketing professor called Mark Ritson, who's quite a serious marketing professor. He swears quite a lot. He's a bit OTT. He's a very sort of working class, straight man. And chat to him, he has these bonkers stories of how he spent a year or two doing ethnographic research of the Pride movement in the US. So he was going to all these Pride parties and learning all about Pride culture in the US and being totally immersed in this world. You're like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that story to come out. I didn't expect him to be so passionate about inclusion as he was. If anything, I'll be honest, I thought he might be a bit of a cynic towards it and think it was all a bit nonsense. I've talked to CMOs and other people who have like really personal experiences, both how they've been treated in the industry or what they've seen externally. Diversity is such a personal thing. There's no one right way of being inclusive. So I hope that people read some of those different perspectives, are emotionally challenged by them. I hope they're really also armed practically. The second half of the book is these 12 chapters that go through these 12 stages of the marketing process. I think you can read it through as a book. I think you read it through and you get a good sense of the overall marketing process. And that's interesting. But I'd love to think people also bookmark it and they come back to it. And then they say right, I'm about to start production on my next TV ad. Let's read that chapter again and remind myself. There are checklists in there as well about, have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done this with your casting? Have you made your production space open and friendly and inclusive and things? So I hope it tells an emotional story. It kind of really inspires people and then it practically helps them. And I guess my biggest wish, which is still a barrier we have to work through, is that I hope it doesn't just preach to the choir. I mean, I think there are going to be people who talk a lot about inclusion who are going to hopefully read it and nod along. I hope we can get it into the hands of some people who maybe have given it less thought or haven't been able to prioritize it and persuade a few of them to start thinking a bit more about it.
Excellent. Jerry, if In Clear Focus listeners would like to learn more about you and your writing, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm quite prolific on Twitter and LinkedIn. So yeah, look for Jerry Daykin on either of those or J Daykin on Twitter. Of course, yeah, the book is now available to pre-order on Kogan page. So it's out in October, but you can read all about it then.
And if you'd like to secure a copy, you can get a 20% discount when you pre-order online at koganpage.com. Just add the promo code BIGEYE20 at the checkout. Jerry, thank you very much for being our guest on In Clear Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to my guest this week, Jerry Daykin, Vice President and Head of Global Media at Beam Suntory, and the author of the book Inclusive Marketing: Why Representation Matters to Your Customers and Your Brand, which is due to be released in October of this year. As always, you'll find a transcript with links to the resources we discussed today on the In Clear Focus page at bigeyeagency.com. Select Podcast from the menu. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to In Clear Focus, produced by Big Eye. I've been your host, Adrian Tennant. Until next week, goodbye.